All right, well, welcome to the webinar, folks. We're just waiting for folks to continue joining for the next couple minutes. As a reminder, since I'm sure we're all pretty used to Zoom land at this point, if you're comfortable being on camera, it's always helpful for conversation. And this is going to be a very conversational webinar, so being on camera is nice. And please make sure to mute yourself when you're not trying to speak on the line. But feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions as we go. Again, we're just going to wait a couple minutes to get started, and then I'll introduce our presenters. Feel free to post in the chat if you're having any tech issues. Vanessa or I can give you a hand with that. As many of you likely know by now, I'm Megan. I'm WCASA's evaluation coordinator. We also have Vanessa with us today. She is our office and training coordinator, excuse me. And our presenters today are Valerie Davis and Leah Green from the Resource Sharing Project. I am so excited to have them presenting today. Val and Leah are both experts and have a wealth of knowledge to share with us around serving survivors in dual programs, as well as in serving survivors in rural communities. So I'm really excited to hear from them today, and I will just pass things off to them.
Great, thank you so much, Megan. Hi, everybody. My name is Leah Green, and I work for the Resource Sharing Project, and I'm really excited to join all of you today. I work at the Resource Sharing Project on all of our rural projects, and this is a topic that's like very close to my heart, and so I'm like really excited to get to talk with all of you for 2 whole hours. Usually we only get an hour and a half together, so I'm so excited for this like expansive, lovely space to be together today. Val, do you want to introduce yourself and then slide right into an exercise?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. It's so good to be with you. My name is Valerie Davis, and I work for the Resource Sharing Project through the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Violence, like Leah does. And I'm zooming in today from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And yes, I'm in my car. And a few times my internet has gone out, like real briefly. So if I'm frozen for a few minutes, it's just because of that. And I apologize. And I will reconnect as soon as I'm able to. I'm like Leah and Megan said, Leah and I both have a lot of experience working in and working with dual programs and rural programs on building meaningful services for survivors of sexual violence. And we're so excited to be here today to talk about Helplines. I mean, it is just like one of our favorite things to talk about. And all the ways that Helplines can be, a really perfect resource for reaching a wide variety of survivors and survivors' needs. And so one of the things that we thought that we would do today is do a grounding activity. We get so busy in our days going from meeting to meeting, with survivors, then shifting and like maybe given a community presentation over Zoom, and then going into a staff meeting. And before you know it, it's the afternoon and you haven't even had a chance to use the restroom or get something to eat, right? And so one of our practices for trainings is to model what we really hope advocates can do for themselves, and that organizations support advocates doing for themselves is just taking a few minutes in between things to get grounded. to become present. And that's so important when we're talking about helplines and survivor services, is being able to shift from what you were doing to now focusing and being present with a survivor. You need to have that opportunity to be able to do that. So today, we're going to start with a very simple grounding activity that's going to, help to connect us and center us in our joy and in our connectedness to, other humans and to, the world outside of ourselves. Um, this is, again, something that you as advocates or those of us who work at coalitions can do in between meetings, in between survivor interviews, or survivor, not interviews. I mean, I was talking about organizational assessments earlier this morning. Survivor meetings, but also this is a technique that you can teach and use with survivors, and that survivors can do for themselves if they start feeling overwhelmed, to become grounded again, and especially centered, with some joyful feelings. So just take a couple seconds and get your body comfortable, whatever that looks like and means to you, whether that's sitting, standing, stretching, like head rolls, taking a deep breath. And this is called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding activity. And so the 5 is about thinking of 5 people that you love. So we'll take a few seconds and just think of 5 people that you love. 4 is to think of 4 places that you love to be, like 4 of your favorite places. 3 is activities. Think of 3 activities that you enjoy. 2 is think of 2 of your favorite foods or tastes or flavors. And then 1 is season. Focus on your favorite season of the year on this lovely first day of fall. Okay, that hopefully, now we're all feeling joyful and more grounded and present with ourselves, so that we can move forward into our conversation about helpline services. So Leah, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and you're going to explain sort of, I think, the format for today and introduce our topic.
Awesome. Thank you, Val. Yes, I do. Thank you for that. I definitely feel more centered and present with all of you, which is exactly where I want to be for the next 2 hours. So in line with what Val was saying about the way that we want to take care of ourselves throughout the workday and how we want to model that here, we are going to take a quick 5-minute break about halfway through the webinar, stretch, grab some water, go to the bathroom, and be back pretty quick. And we're also going to end the webinar 5-10 minutes early so that you all can have a little spaciousness before you have to rush on to the rest of your day. You can take a breath, you can sit with the great conversations and information that you got over the last 2 hours before you have to kind of go back to your busy work day.
And hey, Leah, can I just jump in there real quick to add, again, as I'm thinking about this, again, that's something, again, that we're trying to role model, that like you should try to and want to do for yourselves, but that your organization should support you in doing it. And until that happens, like we're building it in to our time so that then you have the time that is part of this webinar is that, taking, 5, 10, whatever minutes we have to center yourself, to take care of yourself before you move into the next thing. So again, as we talk about organizational supports later on, Leah, I was just thinking like, here's a good way to like, this is something that easily can be done and whatever,
No, absolutely. You're going to see over the next 2 hours as Val and I talk that I really try to bring the perspective of the advocate. And I feel like Val does such a great job of bringing the perspective of the whole organization. And I think together we make a great team. So you will have noticed already that there's not really slides. This is going to be really conversational. And I hope you feel invited into the conversation. Val and I want to have a conversation with each other about helpline services at programs, how we navigate that as advocates, how we navigate that as whole programs. And I want all of you to be able to join in the conversation. You can unmute yourself and speak with us. You can put things in the chat box, however feels best for you to join in the conversation. But I want you to ask questions, share your experiences. Maybe if someone else asks a question, don't feel like we're the only ones that are allowed to answer it. Like put your perspective, share what's going on in your community, your specific program, so that hopefully this will get to feel like a fun, spacious space to be in for the next 2 hours. But that leads us to our topic, which is helpline services. And I think that one, I just like to start off by kind of saying that like in the history of our advocacy programs, helpline services were one of the first services that programs were able to offer all the way back in the 70s. And I really see it as sort of the backbone of our work. And I feel like in present day, the way that a lot of us connect helpline services, it's absolutely how I felt when I was a direct service advocate working at programs, was that the way I watched my coworkers answer the helpline, the stories that were brought to me during staff meeting when I would hear about what the work all my colleagues were doing, and therefore what I felt like I was supposed to be doing was sort of answering the helpline in order to offer shelter services or to help set up in-person services. That's sort of what the implicit goal felt like of helpline services when I was an advocate. We might have talked more spaciously about what the helpline could look like, but the actual structure and training I was given, what I was hearing my coworkers talk about when I was a brand new advocate, really led me to believe like, okay, those are my purposes. I'm supposed to help someone navigate shelter, so they're actively in crisis, actively do not have safety, and that's what I need to spend my time doing. Or if someone called that didn't need shelter, I felt like what I was told my role was to sort of explain what services we offer and then set up a time for them to come in person to have more of an in-depth sort of real quote unquote conversation around advocacy. And as my career has gone on, I've discovered that actually helplines can be so much more expansive than that, so much more creative and trauma-informed than that. And so that's what I'm really excited to talk about today, sort of what that can look like. So really the place I want to start, and my first question for you, Val, is like, when you think about helplines, what do you see as the purpose or the goal of a helpline? Because I think that's sort of where we need to start and center ourselves so that we can figure out like, why are we offering this service? What is the purpose of this service?
Yeah. So again, like you said, Leah, that for so many years, somewhere along the way, our helpline services often switched to, because, many helpline, when I worked at a program, our helpline was answered at the domestic violence shelter. And so you're one staff person and you're running the entire shelter and you're answering, the crisis line or the hotline, as it used to be called. And that's something I know we're going to talk about, Leah, in a little bit. But it was this idea about shelter services, immediate safety, and or getting someone to come in for in-person. But really the purpose of a helpline, and in particular, but not only for survivors of sexual violence, is this being able to meet their needs, their yeah, to whatever like they're calling for, like you meet them in the moment, right? So it's on the survivor's timeline, right? Whether that's at 3 o'clock in the morning and I've woken up, and now I can't get back to sleep, and I'm can't stop thinking about, when I was a kid, 40 years ago, and I just want to be able to talk to someone about that, so I can call the helpline. That it's not just for these uh, crisis of safety, physical safety needs, but it's the ability to help support people with their emotional safety needs, like whenever that comes up. What are some other things that you're thinking about, Leah,
Well,
for
yeah,
goals of-
I mean, just to like add to that is I start to think about the survivors that that coming in person feels too hard or too scary or too big. And so I mean, when we think about trauma-informed services, like creating services that really put folks' trauma at the forefront and design services around them, like I just think how cool it is that we have helplines, because that means that folks can call from the place of safety that feels the most comfortable and safe for them. And so we think often about like real quote unquote helpline services, or sorry, advocacy services, is when folks come in person and we're meeting face to face and we're in our office and we've got all of our paperwork with us and we've got all these resources with us and we can talk through things. And real advocacy absolutely happens that way. But I also feel like real advocacy happens when someone is like in their bed with their like cat or their like favorite stuffed animal, or they're like walking on their like favorite walking path in their community in nature. And that's where they feel safest, most calm, most like prepared to have hard conversations where they explore their survivorship or first even say it out loud for the first time. And you don't have to like have anybody like looking at you. You can be alone. You could be in the dark. You could be like not even looking at your own body and be able to speak some things out into the world that you've never had like the bravery to say out loud before. And how trauma informed that feels to be able to do that and to invite survivors to actually think about where they feel safest in their body, where they feel safest in their environment, and that's where they can access services. And also, I just think that like adding to that trauma informedness is like getting to call when you're actually in a space where you want to talk about something versus like scheduling your appointments for like 3 p.m. on Tuesdays is always when I talk to my advocate. And like, I think that I struggle that sometimes with like therapy or other kinds of appointments where I'm like, maybe I'm just not feeling ready to talk about this when my appointment comes up. Like when it's 3 p.m. on a Tuesday and I'm just like, I'm not in the headspace I want to be. But instead being able to call the helpline and have conversations with people that understand sexual violence, understand trauma, are able to help someone explore healing for themselves, and you getting as a survivor to get to call whenever that moment bubbles up for you, whether it's in that like really calm, safe space that you're in, or maybe something has just come up and things are bubbling to the surface and you're not sure what to do with them and you can't wait for several days for your appointment with your advocate, getting to just access that service in like in the time that you want. And for us as advocates to be able to take those calls and really spend as much time with that person as they need or want to spend, instead of sort of like helping them ground, kind of putting a Band-Aid on it so that they can make it to their Tuesday appointment. Right. Instead, actually just being like, this is going to be your Tuesday appointment. Like, this is the time that it's bubbling up for you or you feel safe. So let's explore right now and not put a time limit on this or not think about all the other work I have piling up, but like my organization has given me the space in order for me to be fully present right now. And I don't have to worry about anything else. If I'm honest, it's one of my favorite things about advocacy is when I'm doing it, I get to be fully present. in a way that like in the real world, I'm like so not present all the time. But like, I always find that like when I start a shift, answering the helpline or like going in to support somebody in the hospital or something, like all my like worldly needs depart. Like the hunger I walked in with is just suddenly gone. Or like I'll like get up from a hotline call and be like, wow, I have not gone to the bathroom in a while. Like I get to be fully present. And I think it takes a lot of support from your organization and the way you structure your space. It is beautiful to get to be fully present with that person in front of you. And I feel like that's what survivors could really benefit from on the helpline.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking too about how you started to say that's like, so I think you said like about reducing isolation. And I think that's so important for like rural advocates in particular, like to be able to like have opportunities to reduce isolation. So for folks who can't come into the office or don't want to come into the office, but it's such a good way to also be anonymous. So not only do I get to call a helpline in my time of need, whenever, whatever time of day that is, whatever space I am in, like, but it's also like, and I can remain anonymous. Like no one will know that it's me. And so that would be true if I was also seeking in-person services. Like maybe this is between my Tuesday appointments with my advocate or whatever, and I want to call, and maybe I don't need to say that it's me. You know, I can like that maybe is what I need for my healing at the time. But then I also just think about helpline services as being like so powerful, is that, you know, really the survivor is the one that's in charge for how long they stay and how long they engage with you, right? Like they have the power to end, which is so much different than meeting in person with someone again, and then like you kind of have to like storm out or like just get up
Yeah.
and leave, like what you can do on the phone. If like it's too much, you can just hang up, you know.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that really puts the like power and control back in the hands of the survivor. You don't have to worry as much about
Right.
like politeness or social pressure, really.
Yeah.
I also think that like one of the things, I don't know if this resonates with anyone else, but when I've worked at several programs across the state of Iowa, and always it felt like helpline services were seen as like the way into services. And then once you were like in,
Yeah.
once you'd like had a first appointment or you'd been taken into shelter, like that really we didn't encourage people to call the helpline again. We were just sort of like, that's how you first interact with us. And then after that, you're just, you know, you're scheduling your Tuesday appointments. I don't know why I keep bringing up Tuesday, but it's working
Right.
for me today. And so I also can see this like really exciting, cool, trauma-informed way of like having people be in services. Schedule your Tuesday appointments, like have your scheduled time where you're going to be with the person that you're working with, but also being able to offer this as an ongoing thing for when those things bubble up. Or just like, you know, being able to offer to someone like, I'm so glad we're working together and I'm so excited to see you next Tuesday. But I know that like between now and then, you're going to go home and visit your family for the holidays. And I know how hard that has been for you. So like, you should feel like you're allowed to also call the helpline. Like it probably won't be me that's the one answering it most likely, but like someone will answer and they will be able to, you know, talk with you about how frustrating your family is. They will be able to help ground you when you're feeling chaotic inside. They will be down to just talk to you about the weather if you just need like an excuse to like walk away from your family. Like, I'm talking to my friend, like I need just some 20 minutes by myself. Like these are the ways that like you can access our helpline, and we're not going to put like a time limit on it. You can just call and get that as you need it, and that it's not weird. Like you're not doing something abnormal. Like we actively are encouraging everyone that comes in for services, use every service whenever you want it. It's not like I'm your designated person and you're never allowed to talk to anybody else.
Right.
Which I think is sometimes how I unintentionally communicated to survivors when I was an advocate, when I felt like this was how my organization was set up.
Right. I remember too, Leah, like when I would be on the the helpline or whatever, and someone would say, hey, I talked to Leah and I have an appointment coming up, but she said I could call, and then they maybe share what they called about, and then without like even like necessarily intending to do it, but it's because it's how it's set up, and
Yeah.
because of maybe how we've been trained, we might spend a little bit of time with you, and then otherwise talk about it with Leah at your Tuesday appointment. And
Mhm.
sometimes that comes in because of the very structure of how and where our helplines are being answered, and by how much support the individual advocate has to be able to be present, and to be able to stay with that call and not need to move on to the next, survivor. And one other thing that I always think about too, and I'm going in a different direction because that's the way my brain works, but with like beautiful things that the helpline offers is it's also a way, again, like whether someone remains anonymous or not, they can call whenever, like we said, when they need to, wherever they're at in their life. But it's also like it's this way to test sharing your experience again.
Yeah.
So like you as a person remain like maybe anonymous if that is what you need, but like this is a way to like not like see someone and be like looking in someone's face or down at their shoes as the first time you're exploring, or the 125th time you're
Yeah.
exploring something, right? It offers that space.
I love that.
Yeah.
I want us to switch in a second because we keep saying helpline services, and I feel like we need to like dive into that verbiage.
Yes,
But really quick, I had one other thought about sort of like what I think is so cool about helplines, what the purpose of a helpline is also that we know that there are more survivors in our communities than there are like advocates to help survivors, right? We just know that's a reality. And particularly when we're talking about our rural communities. And so I also think about how much survivors deserve to have folks accompany them to, obviously to the hospital for evidence collection, but also to like your dentist appointment you haven't been to in 6 years because it's really freaked you out and you've been nervous about it, or to your therapy appointment because you've never seen a therapist before and you just want a friendly face like waiting for you in the waiting room or whatever. Like survivors deserve accompaniment, but we just literally don't have enough people and the capacity and the money to do that for everyone all the time. But what we do have is helplines where we can encourage people like call before your first therapy appointment and we will give you a pep talk. Like call when you finish your dentist appointment and you are so like bursting with pride that you made it all the way through without crying, and there's like no one else in your life that will understand why that was so cool and powerful. Like we will answer the phone and we will celebrate that with you. Like call when you are in the middle of your doctor's appointment and you had a panic attack and you need some help grounding. Like we can't be with you all the time, but you always have 24-hour access to us. And I feel like that is why I see the helpline as like the backbone of services,
yeah.
is because everything we can do in person, we can do on the phone, but just all over our community. But we've been saying helpline for about 30 minutes now, and I feel like we should dive into that verbiage because I think you and I are very specifically saying the word helpline, but most people, I think, say hotline or crisis line. Certainly most of my programs over time use some form of those words. And, I feel like we're making a really distinct choice. So why are you saying helpline, Val? And like, what do you like about the term helpline?
Yeah. So I'm going to tell a little story. So back in the day, I always say, because it's been at least 12 years since I worked at a program, but I worked there for 15 years and I was the director for a good chunk of that time. And one of the things I kept noticing, my own experience when I answer the phone, whether that was on our crisis line, what we called at the time, or even, survivors called us quite a bit, like on our business line. That where was I don't even know what I was going, but I noticed that, again, we called it crisis line. We called it 24-hour hotline. It was answered in our domestic violence shelter. And again, I had noticed this, what was happening, right, was how we were not really given attention and time, and the service on the helpline that survivors of sexual violence in particular. And I got to thinking, like, it really is, it's a support line. Like, I want it to be, and it should be, a place for folks to get support whenever. And it's a place for folks to get information. Even like if it's coming in a form of, it can, like, whatever folks need, they can call like this helpline or this hotline. And that when we call it a crisis line, we teach the community and we teach survivors and we teach our staff that folks then have to be in this crisis that we defined as needing, emergency shelter, or, our immediate safety is in risk. And what it really should be is this opportunity for survivors to get the support that they need whenever. And so I actually, like, maybe 13 or 14 years ago, changed our helpline or our hotline to be, and I called it something crazy, like our 24-hour information and support helpline or something like that, trying to get all the words in there. And so it's just, it really is such a shift, a mindset, again, for your community and how you market what your service is, for survivors who are like, I don't need to call a crisis line. That's for people who are in way more, danger than me. Like, I don't really need to, like, take up someone's time, right, with this, who might be in crisis. And then it informs our organization. Again, and that's how we develop policies and procedures, is then this idea around that the only people who are allowed to call the crisis line or who deserve immediate service are these folks that are in, immediate danger. And not that those folks don't need help and service, but other folks could really benefit from our service if we just reframed it. And so,
yeah, fun fact, the program that Val was actually the executive director of, years later, I worked at, and it was the first program that used something other than like hotline or crisis line to refer to their phone line. And it was the start of like a big shift for me in how I saw the helpline, because as people are saying in the chat box, like, crisis line can feel so intimidating, just like you were saying, Val. Like, I think so many people it's such a high threshold for them to meet, for them to be willing to call it a crisis.
right.
And we have such sweet, kind survivors in our communities that, like, do not want to take services away from other people, don't want to take up space. And so I feel like when we change the verbiage away from something that sounds like you have to actively be in crisis, you don't have to use helpline, like support line. Some people just call it 24-hour line, which I also think is kind of cool, because you're just sort of saying, this is the phone line to use when it's not during business hours. Like, this is also how you get in touch with us. It's really just about your program coming together and talking about, like, what verbiage you feel like your community would respond to, what verbiage you feel like your program likes and your staff likes. Because like you were saying, Val, like, it's not just about what we're communicating to our community, but absolutely we're doing that. But it's also just like when we're calling, because I've also worked with programs that have like called it a support line or a helpline externally, like all their marketing says that, and that's what they say to their community, but internally they're just all still in the habit of calling it a crisis line. And you can feel that, because it's like we're unintentionally all the time reiterating to each other that you sort of need to be in crisis, and if it doesn't meet that threshold, like, I need you to just schedule your Tuesday appointment.
Right. Exactly.
I need to get you off the phone so that I can make space for the people that are having an incoming crisis. And so I feel like word change is really powerful, like externally to our community, but also internally to our own programs. And then I think we also, when we're thinking about these word choices, then have to think about all the ways we've communicated this to our community. So like, do we need to change our website? Do we need to change our brochures? What do we say in our community presentations? How do we talk about this on our social media? Like, what are all the ways that we talk about our helplines to our community internally and externally? And are we really talking about them like expansively? Because I think often, and tell me if you like have had this experience, others on the webinar today, but like I would, when we would talk in our community presentations or on our website, we would talk more expansively about like, this is what we could offer. This is what a support group might feel like. These are the kinds of things we could offer you. We help people with these things. And we'd always just be like, and we have a 24-hour phone line. Like we never explained who can call. What kind of things could you talk about when you called? We just sort of were like, oh yeah, you know what a hotline is. And we have this like very big understanding of what a hotline is in our country. The first hotline ever created was created by the Surgeon General, I think in the like 60s, for suicide prevention. And so it has a long history of being active, scary, big crisis. And so that's what people think of if you don't fill in the blanks for them. How do you think about how you talk to your community, Val, or anyone else? Like, are there creative, I haven't gotten a chance to look in the chat box. Hopefully maybe you're saying cool stuff about this, but like, how do you try to communicate these things to your community? Do you have special ways you talk about your helpline to like invite in as many people as possible?
Yeah, I was just wanting to know too, take a pause for a second and try and see if folks shared in the chat or if anyone wants to unmute and just share about like your experience with the name of your hotline and what you call it, and if anyone has shifted, what that has looked like, or.
Yeah, so Nikki said that in Milwaukee, we refer to it as a 24/7 hotline. Really good point on the crisis line naming and how that might feel intimidating or limiting to folks. I can see how hotline might make them feel that way.
Yeah.
And then Leslie said, this verbiage change is so great to hear because it takes away the feeling of being a burden if they're not experiencing a crisis-like moment.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, I remind members that helplines provide support 24/7. It helps to allow people the space to know it's okay to reach out to these support helplines. And I love that you put like crisis-like in quotation marks, Leslie, because I also think that like there are absolutely survivors that are having what I would call a crisis, and they're still like, I'm not really in crisis. Is it okay if I call? And I'm like, crisis doesn't have to mean someone is actively harming you in this very moment, and that's the only definition. Like, you can be in an emotional crisis. You can be having a panic attack and struggling, and that's still enough of a crisis for you to call. In fact, you can call for far, quote unquote, like less of a crisis than that.
Right.
Amanda calls their line a 24/7 helpline.
Yep. Oh,
Yeah.
So many.
Yeah, this is great.
Things.
I love this. Okay, but I do feel like we gotta move on because I have so much I still want to talk to you about, Valerie.
I was gonna say, it's already like, wow,
I know.
it's time. Okay.
Okay, so I would like to move on to sort of talking about like what's the role then of an advocate in helpline services, because I think it seems as though we are all on board that we want our helplines to be bigger, more expansive, create more space for survivors, and that we don't need them to be an active crisis. Like, it seems like based on the chat box, you guys are on board. But I think the next question then becomes like, but then what does that look like as an advocate? What am I supposed to be doing if I'm not helping people just get into shelter or set up appointments? Like, what does that sort of spaciousness feel like?
Yeah.
So that, like, what do you first think of when you think of like, you're working on the helpline and you answer the phone, what are you helping people do? And I want to know also in the chat box, and I'll type that there, like, what what are you doing on the helpline that you love, that you feel like is working, that is this like really expansive, trauma-informed way that you're communicating with people?
Yeah, well, number one, for me, it's active listening. So often, again, because of how we've framed what the helpline is, whether intentionally or unintentionally, we answer the helpline thinking about the questions that we need to ask for an intake, or for like setting up appointments. And like, that's what we're listening to, right? Is we have information that we need to gather to then get someone into service, use that language. When instead we need to be approaching it with our active listening skills, because listening is a support, and is oftentimes for survivors of sexual violence, the thing that they want is someone to be able to sit with them and listen to them. And when we mean by active listening, like we're meaning like about rapport building, conveying, building a relationship, with someone, or like the ability to talk, converse, that we understand what they're, telling us, and we have skills then that elicit us to be able to like understand more about them, like ask them questions, tell me more about that. And it's about listening to the words that people are saying, but also the meaning behind the words. Like if someone says, like, I'm fine, but like maybe their body language and their tone of voice and their facial expression doesn't match that. Like, we're listening to all of those things. And that has often been the struggle, I think, that advocates have had and programs have had over the years, is shifting into that like idea that the service I am giving is listening and being with someone, and being that person that they get to share like their deepest pain with. And that I can do that for as long as I need to, as often as I need to, and someone is just there to be present with me and to listen.
I agree that that's so hard to do though, because listening can feel so passive that it
Right.
feels like we're not quote unquote like doing our
Doing.
jobs, because I'm not providing something, I'm not answering a question, I'm not helping
Yeah.
you through something. And so personally, when I would answer the helpline, like I would keep like fidget toys with me, or like coloring books, or like pen and paper, just to help me be quiet, because the impulse to respond or say something, but somebody's on a roll or they're trying to find the words, like, and I needed to be able to stay quiet for myself, and things to help me stay focused. The way that like something to fidget with gives you just enough of something to be doing that you can dedicate the rest of your brain to really listening and being present, I think is really helpful. Or like even just be able to jot things down, like, because a lot of times survivors recall and they'll say like so many things, and I don't want to forget, like, oh, they just made something, I really want to respond to that, but they're going and I don't want to interrupt. So I'm like writing down all these things that I want to make sure I don't forget or I get to, or maybe I don't need to say them at all, but just writing them down helps me be like, okay, I had the thought, I wrote it down, I want to keep listening, and just let myself be like present with this person. I think that my other thing when I think about helpline services that is like kind of like undervalued sometimes is just like helping someone orient to the call, because I think that we can all agree that it takes a lot of bravery to call a 24-hour line like this, where you've no idea who's going to answer for the first time, or even if you're like actively in service. Once again, we're battling all these feelings of like taking up too much space, or like not being the right kind of person to call, even when you're actively in service. And so I feel like a lot of times when I would answer the call, the person almost wouldn't know what they're calling to talk about, because
Right.
it was just like an act of desperation, just like I can't be alone with these thoughts anymore, or I don't know what to do, I'm just gonna call. And so I feel like just sort of like clearly and warmly like answering the phone and saying your name and the name of your program. I've spoken to a lot of programs that have a policy where they like don't say the name of their program when they answer the phone, for like safety reasons. But I just think you're doing such a disservice to the people that are calling by not sort of warmly answering the phone and being like, this is, this program. Because I think I have personally called helplines where people are just like, hello. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have not called the right place. What's going on? What does this even mean? And then being able to like offer a, oh, I love that. Susie says we have a blind line option. It's a whole different number. That's so great. But like being able to offer like an intro into the conversation, like just saying sort of like if someone's really struggling with like what to talk about or like how to start, I like to say things like, what's coming up for you right now, or, tell me a little bit about how you're feeling right now. Just like a way into the conversation, I think is such a blessing when you don't know what to say, or even just being able to say like, I'm really comfortable with silence. So like take your time to figure out the words you want to say. Like, I'm here to sit and I'll sit with you for as long as you need to sit. Maybe you don't need to say anything. You just don't want to be alone in this moment. And I will just sit here and I'll play with my fiddle toys and I will listen and you'll hear my breath and know that I'm present. And that's okay. Or even just being able to be like, let's talk about how frustrating it is that you don't know how to talk. Like you tell you feel frustrated that you don't know how to start this conversation. Let's just talk about how frustrating it is that like you felt so silenced for so long that like you don't know how to talk about this yet. Like just finding a way into the conversation to let that person create the space for themselves instead of, I think, unintentionally sort of pressuring people to get to the point or having a time limit, making you feel like you can't be as expansive and I keep saying the word expansive and like patient as you want to be in that moment.
Yeah. I also think like one of the important skills that pairs with active listening and is a part of active listening, and number one, the ability to be present with someone. And I could talk forever about like what does that mean, and what like supports need to be put in place so advocates can be present. So we'll talk about that at some point, I'm sure. But is just the ability to help someone ground themselves is such an important like skill to have on the helpline. Because again, as you know, Leah, we're talking about like a lot of the examples that we're sharing about like how your helpline could, like the types of survivors or the types of needs that folks might be calling into your helpline if you have this more expansive way, is like folks that could really maybe benefit from you doing a grounding activity with them, and finding out, exploring with them what would be grounding to them, right? So whether it's this like breathing activity or this 5-2-4-3-1 activity that we did, or if it's helping them, know that they're currently in the present, all the tons of grounding activities based upon, what the need is. But that's such a important, again, skill to have on the helpline. And then again, just our ability to validate and support folks. Like, right, we don't have to have answers. And that is not our role as advocates to have answers. And some of that comes from shifting our mindset and understanding about survivors and trusting that they have their own answers and they're not broken. They don't need to be fixed. They're not calling us or reaching out to us because they need fixed or there's some problem that they need us to solve. What they're reaching out for is support for their healing and maybe information and someone to talk through options with or feelings with, or just to sit with them, like you're saying, and just be present and quiet with them. And so like being able to validate and support survivors in their whatever they're feeling, in their strength and courage and power as a human being. Like those are all the things some of the things, they're not all the things, but those are the things that in particular survivors of sexual violence might need when they're calling on our helpline. Yeah, what survivors trust us is such a privilege. Absolutely.
Yeah, Serena maybe said checking in with letting them know it's okay to not be okay, and
Yeah.
glad that they called rather than handling it alone, I think is such a beautiful way of like letting someone know like you are in the right space, you are not in the wrong space, like we are here with whatever you call with. So Megan wrote, I think telling someone you are glad they called is so important, such a small statement that could have such a big impact. And then Sylvia said, and also to view what survivors trust us with as such a privilege.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that comes to mind is also just that like, ooh, I don't know if I have a good word for this, but like sort of non-judgment, but also sort of like just maybe like a creative brain of like whenever someone calls and they're talking about something that you're like, this is what you're using the helpline for, that you're like, I think of it as like a creative thing of like, I want to do the gymnastics to get to why this is really trauma informed. If someone just calls me every day to talk about the weather for an hour and I'm starting to be like, why are you taking up my space just to talk about the weather? Like being able to be like, okay, so what are the 6 degrees of separation between like talking about the weather and trauma? Like, what is this call giving you that maybe my first thought is to not understand why you're doing this? How can I get to that place of understanding why you might call just to chat about something that feels normal, that like reduces your loneliness or your isolation, that gives you a piece of like community back, that gives you space away from maybe other people in your life that don't feel good right now, that maybe you've really isolated yourself and you just actually need to like be able to speak out loud, like you're actually just maybe so kind of cocooned in, you're just not even really using your voice. Like, what are the things that I can do in my brain to help get to this place of really understanding why you're calling to talk about this specific thing, is something that like I really value for myself.
Yeah, and Leah, it makes me think of again this idea that how did you say that now? Now I've lost my train of thought.
The 6 degrees of separation between trauma and
Again,
weather.
it ties into like again one of the benefits of having a helpline where survivors can call when they need to. They can be anonymous if they want to, and it's a place to break isolation and to test talking. And so, like I said before, like one of our greatest skills that we can use on the helpline is rapport building. That might be what those weekly calls are about, talking about the weather. Could be all the things that you just said, but also it's like they're wanting to build a relationship with someone. They're wanting to learn to trust someone. They're wanting to test what it's like having a conversation with someone before they share their deepest pain. Right. So again, not thinking about it like these conversations about the weather is in some way in service to, or like I've got to try and get a disclosure out of them.
Right.
But recognizing the value of the service that you are providing by talking to them for, every week about the weather is giving them something, whether that's, again, testing, talking to someone, breaking isolation, whatever, that trust that there is a reason that they called. And they may or may not be able to verbalize to you, but they called you. And so they're just trust that you are providing them with what they need, especially for callers who call back, right? They must have got support and they're calling back again, because otherwise they probably might not call back, right? If they didn't feel supported when they called the first time.
Exactly. Sylvia put in the chat box, I also appreciate what I learned in another Zoom meeting recently. Sometimes let that awkward silence happen so that the survivor is encouraged to say what they need instead of us assuming what they're trying to say to us, which is absolutely when the fidget toys and the coloring books like come in handy, because that silence can feel really awkward. But I feel like beautiful stuff comes out at the end of it for sure. And then Ashley put, we use whose need is it often to help reframe, which is absolutely the words I was trying to say, much better words than I was trying to say. And you captured that beautifully.
Yes, that is so perfect. I'm just thinking, I'm sorry, Leah, but
yeah,
yes.
go.
Thinking about like, is my interaction with the survivor, am I trying to get my needs met, and by my needs as my personal advocate self, or my organization, what I've been taught? Or is this about meeting what the survivor needs? And we should always be doing what the survivor needs. But again, maybe someday we'll talk about organizational supports so that advocates can, and I say someday just because like, I know that we're already like that.
Well, I was just about to say, I think we've got a little time if we stop now. So I think let's take a 5-minute break, like give your brain a little rest, grab some water, go to the bathroom, stand up, do a stretch, and let's come back 5 minutes from now and we'll talk about what are some of the like organizational supports that will be in place that will help you do this really creative, expansive vision of really cool helpline advocacy. So I'm going to count on Megan maybe to tell me, should we just do like, we're in the same time zone. Okay, sorry, I panicked. I was like, what time zone are we in? Okay, 11:05. We'll come back together. Okay.
Sounds good.
Thanks. We'll come back together in about a minute.
Well, I'm wondering if at some point, and not right now, because I know that your tech situation is not super conventional, but I'm wondering if at some point you could send me the grounding exercise that you sent so that we could send it out with the recording after. I'm thinking that folks might want to use that one. I really liked it.
Yes, I absolutely will.
Thanks.
Okay, so it's 11:05 and we still have a lot we want to talk about, so I'm going to start us promptly back. So we've talked a lot about advocacy skills, what we call our helpline, the purpose of the helpline. And I think, Val, you always say it best when you talk about how we got to tie this back to what the organizational supports are for this work, because every one of us can be the most dedicated, on board, expansive, most trauma-informed advocate in our program. But if we don't have the supports from our organization that allow us to not have time limits on phone calls or allow you to set aside other work so that you can be fully present when you're answering the helpline, it's pretty hard to be that like perfect trauma-informed, expansive advocate. So where do you start when you start thinking about the ways that organizations can support their staff members on the helpline?
Yeah, two places for me, and they both involve staffing. One, again, to make sure that your helpline is answered by fully trained, sexual assault advocates. I know for some programs, like they maybe don't train people who answer the helpline because it's primarily for domestic violence. They don't train them in how to respond to a sexual violence survivor. And so the protocol, the policy, the procedure is we'll take a message and an advocate will call them back. Right. And so being able to have this ability for the helpline to be available whenever a survivor needs it, to be able to meet whatever time of day, whatever location, whether or not they want to be anonymous, like all of those things require that like we have a staff person who answers the phone, trained and available to meet their needs at that moment. And the other thing around staffing that means is like staffing your helpline in a way that allows for staff to give their sole attention to the helpline. Again, trying to do that if you are the sole like staff person at a domestic violence shelter, which I have been before, and which the program in which I was the director for did. Like one person often answer or at the shelter and answering the helpline. And you're setting that advocate up for not being able to either meet the needs of survivors or not being able to meet the needs of the survivors in your shelter, or not being able to meet the expectations of their job and always feeling like they're failing because they're not giving the attention that any survivor needs because they're trying to juggle too much at the same time. So those are the first two like organizational supports that automatically come to mind. Are there things, Leah, that you can think about?
I think about scheduling the helpline a lot because I have worked at programs where we only have like 4 staff members. So like the number of people able to take the helpline is really limited, or like a lot of rural programs where we need to like, our service area is so big, like different people need to take the helpline because of the number of calls that come in, or like the number of people we have to dispatch out to shelter and things. And so I think it's really important to think about how you schedule the helpline. And I think one thing that's great is when programs will schedule like, October's helpline schedule. And when you put together the schedule of who's going to be working the helpline as a supervisor, as an organization, also schedule what's our vacation time going to look like this month, so that you're sort of building it in, like you're going to take care of yourself because we know helpline work is hard and we respect that. And so we want to explicitly say, you also need to be taking vacation time as you do these things to take care of yourself, refill your cup, be fully present. And that when you are not on the helpline, it is like an organizational value that when you are not on the helpline, you are not on the helpline, and that like your time off is fully respected, because the only way I think you can be fully present on the phone is when you're not on the phone, also getting to live your life. And so that like as an organizational value that is explicitly stated, when work things bubble up and you're the supervisor trying to figure out how to do them, that like you are respecting those people's time. And then also just having some more flexibility when you as the supervisor are like putting together the on-call schedule, that you build more flexibility into the schedule. So like some programs do like kind of creative, interesting ways where they do that, where they'll like maybe schedule me and Val will take the next week of work. And it's not like Leah takes Monday and Val takes Tuesday. It's like Leah and Val get to have a conversation about like, well, you always pick your kids up from school from 3 to 4. And so like, I'll definitely take it because my kids aren't in school then. And so we can like divvy up the schedule that actually respects both of our unique life circumstances and what's going on in our lives. And that it's like a deal we've made together that is like respected by the agency, that like Leah and Val are going to be responsible, but we're going to get to kind of do whatever we want that works for us. Or as a supervisor, if you see like Val is really struggling and had a really hard couple of advocacy appointments today, like, and you know Val is going to take the helpline that night, like seeing how you can help someone else take it, because Val's probably not going to be able to be fully present tonight and give survivors everything that they need when you're answering the line that night. And just taking into consideration people's mental health, their like lived experience, what is going on in their lives, so that you are taking care of folks' like emotional state as so that they can be as fully present. And I think that implicitly also says to advocates, like, we want you to be fully present. We want you to be able to give yourself and be, as Alex said earlier, in the zone on the call. And so like, these are the things we can put in place to help you be in the zone. That's what comes up for me a lot, because I think that a lot of programs scheduling the helpline can feel punitive. It can feel like a punishment. It can be, I've spoken to programs where advocates are on call for like an entire month at a time, and there isn't a backup. A lot of rural programs just don't have the capacity to have really expansive visions of how they schedule things. But I think we got to start putting our place there, because you cannot be present when you're just like overwhelmed.
Absolutely. So that's part of the staffing. I love that.
Yeah.
You're even suggesting, or like, oh, because again, like we need to change how it's staffed, that it's actually then a schedule. And then all the things that trauma-informed way you can go into like building your schedule. But it all comes back to me to our policies and our procedures, right? And so some of the other things that I was thinking about that, you know, we should put into our policies and procedures is, I have seen programs like their policy is like survivors are only allowed to call X amount of times. X amount of times a day, X amount of times a week, X amount of times ever. And they're only like, we have to like get off, like our mission is to get off calls within 15 minutes. We're not allowed, like, do not spend more than 15 minutes. All of these like policies and procedures, like those two examples, like are really, again, about me and what the program is saying. Like, and sometimes programs put those things in place. I have seen programs put time limits and caps on survivors calling as a way to help, like, this is not a good way, but like in an attempt to mitigate vicarious trauma, as a way to help manage the workload, right? Is to say, well, you only ever need to be on a call for 15 minutes, or like someone, like we have to stop Deb from calling. So we are only going to, we need to tell her that she's only allowed to call 2 times a week. And if she calls that third time, you have to say like, hey, Deb, you already called twice this week, so I can't talk to you. Like those have been written into policy and procedure. And so not doing that and actually having the policy and procedure that says we will not put a time limit. There are no caps on like time limit of the call or the time limit that someone can use the helpline, that survivors are invited to take as much time as they need. And yeah, I go to that so much because I've just seen those policies and procedures. And another policy and procedure that I think I keep looking at the clock, and I'm sorry, because I know we're like,
You're okay.
is to have the helpline be all that it needs to be, is we need to have policies and procedures in place for it to be multilingual access. And that means, lots of languages, but then also that it would include American Sign Language or ways to serve the deaf community. And so I was trying to think of some of the other policies and procedures, Leah, that we wanted to elevate today, because we won't be able to get to all of them.
And that's okay. I think also like my biggest takeaway from all the things that you're saying right now is really like, one, your program should have policies and procedures about this. Because I think part of what we were saying at the beginning of this is like that sometimes we think of the helpline service as this like throwaway service. Yeah, we do that. We always do that. That we spend a lot more time. It's like rare to have a webinar or a training about helpline services. Like I think we all just think we definitely know what we're doing there, that we sometimes don't have policies or procedures, or we don't talk about it as a whole staff about what that work looks like or what our priorities are, what we're doing. That's kind of what I was saying at the beginning. Like I just kind of learned implicitly from like listening to my coworkers as they would kind of maybe say a thing or two here or there about their helpline work, but that's how I learned about it, not because we had like a whole staff meeting where we talked about like, how's our helpline work going? Or we ever like evaluated our helpline services. It was kind of something that was just on the back burner. We all know what's going on, but we don't have time to like think about it or talk more explicitly about it. So I think it's like have policies and procedures that address these things. And if you do have them already, like go back, revisit them, think about them, talk about them as a whole agency, figure out like, are these policies serving us? Are they serving survivors? What is the purpose of these policies? Like, how does this work within it? Is this still working, or did someone write this policy like 5 supervisors ago? Like relook at some of that work and just be critical of it and think like maybe you get to the end of that process and you're like, dang, we got really great policies and we feel good about this work, but that also feels really good to get to a place where you're like, we thought about this, we reflected on it, and it's working for us. That's never going to be time misspent, right? But often you're going to find something where you're like, this is kind of an outdated policy, or this isn't actually like how we're using this in practice, so maybe we need to rewrite this. Or from a supervisor perspective, I felt like this was working, but when I listened to the direct service staff that were answering the phone, I was hearing that this isn't really working out well, and just kind of paying attention to those things.
Yeah, well, it's going to take an organizational shift, right? And thinking about what we value. And that also means being able to find ways to concretely talk about our services and the value of listening. Because again, folks feel that pressure from their organizations, who feel that pressure from funders to be able to show the concrete services that we provided. And sure, you can say, maybe count it as a helpline call. But but you're also like valuing listening and being present. And if you can count that as a service, whether you count that as your service with your funder, which, that's a different thing, but like in your program, you value and you count the times that you spent listening to survivors, being present with them, supporting them, that then again tells you that those are priorities, and that help guide your work to provide it in the way that we want survivors to be
Absolutely. So, I think that now we want to give you guys some time to talk to each other, because I think we've spent the last hour and 20 minutes talking about a lot of stuff. So I think we're going to put you guys into breakout rooms so you can have a little time with each other to talk about what you've learned today, where you want to go, what do you want to bring back to your individual advocacy practice, what do you want to bring back to your organization to talk about. And I promise at the end of this, I will send you some resources to help you have those conversations with your organization. So I'm putting 3 questions in the chat box right now. And then Megan is going to be putting you into breakout rooms. And Megan, do you guys do breakout rooms often? Do people know what it's going to feel like to be whooshed away to the breakout room?
We have done breakout rooms before
Okay.
in some of our trainings, so I don't know. It sort of depends if folks were on for one of those, but
Okay.
a pop-up will show up on your screen from Zoom that invites you to join a breakout room, and then you just click join.
And then once you're in your room, you can open the chat box, and the conversation that is happening right now, you will still get to see. But if you use the chat box to talk to each other in your room, we won't see that when you come back together, when we come back to the main room. But the 3 questions I put in the chat box so that you can, I'll put them in again since a couple of people chatted since then, which is great. The 3 questions I want you to talk to your group about are, what do you need from your organizations to enact this model of advocacy we've been talking about? What are you excited to bring back to your program or to your individual advocacy practice? And what have you heard so far that feels like a shift in how you might see advocacy? So you can talk about any of those. We'll come back in 20 minutes, do a little recap. I will give you many resources for Helpline work, and then we will break a few minutes early so you can center yourselves before you go back to work. Any questions?
So just a heads up, it looks like it is going to send Leah and Val into groups as well.
Cool.
All
We'll
right.
just stay behind so you guys can have some space to yourselves. No worries.
Okay. Wonderful. I'm just keeping an eye out now for if anyone ends up in a room by themselves, because
Cool.
as has happened when we've done rooms in the past, people sometimes bail when they
Yeah.
Is it possible to send someone aside from me into the room with Jill?
You can also just move Jill to another room.
Yeah, I'm trying to see which, because I have a couple other people that are going to need a partner or two.
Okay.
So I'm trying to see where they're.
And I'm also happy to go in any room if we felt like that was helpful.
Yeah, I'm not going to join a room if that's.
That's
Yeah,
okay.
no, that's totally fine.
Courtney, Amber, and Dak, do you need help getting to your rooms? Are you maybe Wakasa staff I don't know of?
They are not Wakasa staff, but also rooms are not compulsory. So if folks don't want to
No.
join the rooms, that's fine. But
Or if you want to
Or they
have a
may have stepped
conversation
away.
right here, we can make a room right now here.
yeah, this could be your room.
They're probably answering the helpline as we speak.
Yeah, that's usually what it is if somebody's not going to their room. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you both so much. And thank you to Vanessa for for being on standby, as I have multiple times now had the weird Zoom thing happen that all the font goes away. That's why I keep dropping off and rejoining.
That's so scary. I hope that never happens to me. I don't know how I would deal with that.
How you deal with it is just leaving and coming back, but it doesn't let you leave.
That's
You have to
good.
go to Task Manager and close out of Zoom that way. And actually it'll close Zoom and then automatically reopen it if you do it that way. So it's really great.
Okay, well that That was very good technical assistance. I feel very prepared.
I have now, I think I'm cursed when it comes to Zoom. I think I have a Zoom curse.
I think you're probably not alone in having a Zoom curse. If that makes
I don't know what I did to deserve it, but somehow I brought this upon myself, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, people said stuff right at the end. I wanted to look at the chat box.
Oh yeah, actually what someone brought up is something that if you have time to discuss a little bit, I think would be good. That they brought up that they're the volunteer coordinator, but that they're the backup if a volunteer doesn't answer.
Yeah.
And that means they feel like they're always on call. I know that a lot.
And they are, you know.
And I know that quite a few programs put one staff in that position.
Okay.
So it might be a helpful thing to talk about.
Back. Folks are trickling back in.
And we have more faces. Hi. It's wonderful to see all of your beautiful faces.
Okay, there we go. Everybody's back. I hope you had great conversations. Any big takeaways that you want to share with the group about how your conversation went? You can put it in the chat box or you can unmute yourselves. And I can put the questions in the chat box again, just in case you guys use the chat box in your room and you don't remember the questions.
One of the things that we noticed between the three of us, and I believe we were in Breakout Room 6, is that all of us work in some sort of capacity with a DV program as well as the sexual assault program as well. And what we found amongst ourselves is that whoever's responding on the hotline, helpline, is more equipped or more regularly sees more calls coming in relation to DV than sexual assault. And Rosie, I'm not sure where she is on my screen, but one of the things that she's putting together, I know she said her mic wasn't working, is to actually put together a resource guide for whoever's on the hotline to be able to respond a little bit better and be educated about human trafficking calls as well as sexual assault calls. And I thought that was fantastic. I know for myself, it has been talked about to train the shelter advocates that we have, those that are answering the hotline, and the interns to be able to respond more adequately to sexual assault calls, because it may be fewer and far in between because we're having both of these calls come into the helpline, but they're still just as important.
Absolutely. That's a great observation your group made. And I feel like is a truth for the vast majority of programs across the country. And so often what we see is that shelter advocates, because they're 24 hours, are the ones tasked with answering the helpline, and they usually get, the least access to training. The pay is usually the lowest, and they have the most contact with domestic violence survivors because of shelter setting. So I feel like that's a great observation Group 6 made. Anyone else want to share from your group? I'm really comfortable with silence, so take your time. Yes, Alex, we all need more time and more people. I am so with you. Is there anything that you want WCASA to know about what you need as a program in your state to be able to enact this model? Because we got a lot of WCASAns on the call, so. That's okay. Thank you so much for offering. Okay, Alex said, but also just bringing back some of the discussion surrounding boundaries and structuring who the backup on-call point of contact is, so it's not always me. And I agree, that's huge. Nikki said at one point, Wakasa talked about putting together a guide or training for volunteers. Is that something still planning to do?
That is something that is still in some sort of in progress. Alma, do you want to share a little about that?
Yes, actually right now, I feel like we are halfway there. We have a committee at Wicasa that is working on this. We have met twice, and now we have some materials that we need to organize, and then we can share those with all of you. Hopefully that will happen before the end of this year. But yes, we are working on it. And since we have time to share, I was just telling the other person that was in the room with me that, at Wicasa, sometimes we get calls from survivors, and they don't feel comfortable calling, the programs themselves. And a lot of times, or some of the times, we end up calling on their behalf. That happened to me on Monday. And unfortunately, 5 different programs that I did call, they were not very attentive. One of the young ladies that answered the helpline, I could hear the children fighting in the background, and it was just not ideal. So we still need a lot of work to do, a lot of training and education. Some of the programs, one of the survivors was sharing with me that a lot of programs are just like, good luck. And, not thanks for calling, not you can call anytime, or, would you like to set up an appointment with an advocate, nothing. So it's kind of disappointing, to hear that. But again, we still a lot of work to do. We still need a lot of work to do.
Thanks for sharing, Alma. We only have a couple minutes left together before I want to give you some space to have some time before you go back to work. I want to offer some resources that might be helpful, as well as Wicasa is going to continue to have these conversations with all of you. I held a roundtable with different rural programs a couple of years ago, where we brought folks together in person from rural programs kind of spanning the whole country, and just said, like, what is working with your helpline? What do you want to brag about? How do you schedule your helpline? What do you call your helpline? To really get like a snapshot of where folks are at. And there's a lot of really great information that we were able to collect and put into a resource that I'm putting in the chat box. It's called Support Connection Healing, Rural Helplines Today. And there's a lot of information directly from programs about what they're doing or how they structure their services or what they keep in their on-call binder, lots and lots of information. And then we had put together a conversation guide in order to have that helpline roundtable, thank you. And so we ended up putting together all the questions that we'd asked programs, the ways that we had started to generate conversation amongst these people, and put that together into a resource I just put in the chat box. It's called Facilitation Guide, Conversations on Rural Helplines. And you can take that resource and bring it back to your program and use some of those prompts to start to have conversations with your whole staff around how you're hosting the helpline, how you're evaluating the helpline, what you're calling your helpline, so that everyone can be involved in the conversation, executive directors all the way down to volunteers, people directly answering the helpline. We also created something to respond directly to what you said, Kimberly. We, in another in-person training we'd hosted, we heard from a number of programs that their reality is your reality, that folks in the shelter setting are often the ones that answer the helpline. And because they're working in a shelter setting, they have domestic violence on the brain, and they struggle sometimes to have some of those slower paced patient, exploratory conversations with sexual assault survivors that call on the line. So together, this program and I created this thing I'm putting in the chat box called our Crisis and Support Line tip sheet. And it is printable as like a front and back piece of paper. And a lot of programs tell us that how they use it is they like laminate it and put it next to the phone line. There's one side is like prompts for how to have conversations with the people calling. And the other side is for you as an advocate to use when the call is over to help you feel centered, grounded, and like pace yourself so that you can answer the phone line again. And then lastly, we created a resource called Tips for Active Listening, which is pretty much what it sounds like. It's tips for how to be active and present when you're answering the phone line. Yeah, Val, I know you have a couple things you want to share.
Do you want to pop one in, Leah, and then I'll talk about
Yeah.
whichever one you chose?
Yeah, so I'm going to put in picturing your program.
Okay. And I did notice that Jill has a lot of questions that I hope someone is gathering, or I think it should be saved in the recording as well. So if we don't have time today, that then CASA staff can follow up. But Leah popped into the chat our picturing your program. It's a toolkit. It's not specific to Helpline, but if any program out there wants to start thinking about shifting services and building more meaningful services for survivors of sexual violence, this toolkit will help you get a picture of where you're at right now. Like what is your program's capacity for meaningful sexual assault services? And it's a comprehensive toolkit. And so feel free, I'll put my contact information in the chat as well. It can be very overwhelming and like we can talk about it for days. And so feel free to reach out to me about that as well. And Leah already popped my address in the chat box. So again, thank you, Leah. And then the next one I think Leah was going to put in was, again, this is like maybe a front and back sheet, again, about listening to survivors and some just essential steps for the intake process. Again, changing the way we think about intake. And again, not making it be about us and our needs, but about what is important for survivors. And so, yeah, those were just some other resources that we wanted to make sure that you all have. And again, that we're available for ongoing conversations. We're available to talk about any concept we mentioned. This was trying to give you a big overview. And so any of those topics within this big topic that you want to explore further, let Vanessa, Megan, Alma know, or again, you could just reach out to us as well, directly to me.
Yes, please reach out if you want to talk about any of these things.
Thank you so
specific to
much.
your
Yeah, those
program.
resources are,
Go ahead, Alma.
no, I was going to say thank you so much for sharing those resources. I know that, at our Save Us training, sexual assault advocacy school, we actually do some of the tools that you just share with all of us. And for our SADI program, ours is called PDI, but it's similar to the SADI program. We use the picture in your program, and other materials from RSP. So thank you.
Thank you, Alma. And picturing your programs like maybe one of my favorite things we've created, and it's big and it's scary, but it's so good. And I can say that because I didn't write it, so I'm not bragging. Val wrote it. So someone asked me privately if there's going to be a recording and where they can access. And I know at least one person asked if the things we put in the chat box, the resource we put in the chat box, can be emailed. I feel like those are WCASA questions. And then we're out, we're done.
Yes to both of those. There will be a recording available. It will be like all of our other webinars up on the YouTube page and also linked on our website. And we will have those documents sent out to you in an email as follow-up, along with an evaluation survey.
Great. So take the next 7 minutes to grab some water, take a breath, go stand outside, recenter yourself, and have a lovely day. I really enjoyed getting to talk to all of you.
Bye, everyone.
Hi, thank you all so much. Thanks to Val and Leah for presenting, and thanks to all of you for the work you do every day on behalf of survivors. Thanks.